Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this webinar, which is a really important topic, I think, right now, especially with what we are seeing as a result of the crisis that has ensued over the past few months. So empathy, culture and performance, what now? That is the title. I'm joined by two experts in this field. The first, you'll probably notice for people that joined from the invite, a little bit different to what we had in the invite. So Catherine, unfortunately, couldn't be with us today, but Anastasia Simons, who's the Brand and Communications Manager for Are You OK, has very kindly offered to step in at this last minute. Thank you so much for doing that, Anastasia. And we've also got Daniel Murray, who's the founder of Empathic Consulting. So welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
I will start by just going through a little bit of a bio on you guys, just so that people get a sense of who you are. So Anastasia, so Are You OK? Hopefully everyone does know what Are You OK is, but it's an Australian suicide prevention charity with a mission of inspiring and empowering everyone to meaningfully connect with the people around them and to support anyone struggling with life. And Anastasia, I know that that's something that you have a great passion for as well, and you're responsible for the creation and execution of the Are You OK brand and content strategy. Daniel, so after a career in corporate strategy and management consulting within Australia's largest financial services organisations, you now help businesses and leaders to drive performance through people, culture and empathy. And that is a blending of background in mathematics and strategy, deep understanding of emotions, neuroscience, behavioural economics. You've basically become an expert in building capabilities, tools and strategies to embed strategic empathy. So wow, that's a lot of good background there, a lot smarter than someone like me. But again, both of you, thank you so much for coming on. This is a very important topic. And if I get straight to it, so the crisis that we are facing at the moment can only really be characterized as a human crisis. It's one that has affected us on so many different levels. So the virus itself on our immediate health, obviously the impact on the economy, but also the impact on our mental health at that same point in time. Now, the question is, how do we navigate through a human crisis to address the issues right now that we have, but how do we come out the other side of this better and stronger than we were before as well? Anastasia, if I can start with you, how is Are You OK seeing things at the moment in terms of society's mental health at large?
So what we know is that there are a number of stresses and pressures which can aggravate underlying issues that people might be facing when it comes to their mental health. And so, pre-COVID-19, pre-coronavirus, and what that might have looked like is, fluctuation in your working circumstances, financial issues, relationship issues, health issues. And now we're in this situation where, on top of life's ups and downs that we all have to navigate, we've got these added pressures and stresses from the coronavirus pandemic. And so, the situation that people are in is that many people are in a state of flux, whether that's changes in, the hours of work, the income that's coming in, the ability to know what's coming next in that environment, but also the ability to rely on those tools that we might have built up over time to manage our health and well-being. So things that we might have done for ourselves more regularly, being able to leave the house, get out and exercise, connect with other people in a physical sense, and of course other activities that you might do for your health and well-being, going to the gym, going for a coffee. Those things are no longer available to people. So you've got these additional pressures and stresses. You've got a changing, circumstances when it comes to the toolbox that we would normally use for our well-being. And that kind of creates a bit of a perfect storm when it comes to people's mental health and ability to navigate these times. So from Are You OK's perspective, it's even more important that we're not just checking in on ourselves, but also checking in on the people around us, because we do know that there is a lot going on. And for a lot of people, if they were asked that question, they would probably respond, you know what, actually, I'm not okay.
Yeah, definitely. And Daniel, if you look at some of the things that you're seeing from the biggest changes across workplaces, what are you seeing as a result of the crisis, particularly when it comes to the work that you do?
Yeah, I think there's some interesting changes. The things that I'm really noticing is that in business, we tend to focus on big numbers or big processes and systems, and we try and identify what's really important, and we sort of forget about a lot of stuff. And what this current situation is highlighting, that a lot of those little tiny things that we sort of discredit or don't worry about actually really matter. Now, having conversations at the coffee shop, even having a coffee shop to go to, spending time walking in and out of the office, commuting, all of these things build up our standards and our rituals and the way we interact with the world. And when we start to strip some of those away, we start to really notice that the things aren't exactly as we think they are. And so what I'm seeing is a lot of organizations where things like trust have become highly questioned. You know, I've got leaders saying, well, how do I know they're doing their work when they're sitting at home? And my question back to them was, if you don't trust them that much, where did you know they were doing work in the office? Just because they're in proximity doesn't mean that they're connected. And it's really highlighting for me this difference between being connected in a physical sense or being in proximity and actually being engaged in a more emotional or a deeper sense. And that engagement is something that organizations and people who've got that are doing much better, I think, than those people who had those sort of tenuous or you know, very paper thin levels of culture and engagement with other people.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point about I think something we've talked about before is there's this difference between physical distancing and social distancing. And I think that a lot of the problem is that people say, oh, it's all social distancing. Well, no, we actually do want to be closer together at the moment. We don't want to be in physical proximity because that's the danger, but it's even more dangerous if we break that social connectivity as well. So if we look then at ourselves and understanding each other, the role of mental health, and I know that Anastasia, you talked about it a little bit at the start, but looking at the role of mental health pre-COVID versus now, what do you think has changed? Because I know it was something particularly in the Australian society that has been gaining momentum in terms of the awareness and understanding of how important it is. What do you think has changed now that we've gone through this crisis?
So I think certainly for many people it might be at the front of their minds, and you know, we can't forget that prior to the coronavirus pandemic, there was a period of extreme stress for a number of Australians with the bushfires and the floods, you know, and that was coming off the back of a drought and various other pressures and stresses for people in those particular locations. What we also know is that the landscape has changed somewhat. So the provision of services for people who do need some extra support has had to shift and shift quite fast. So when you used to be able to go face to face and have a consultation either with your GP, your local doctor, or indeed with a psychiatrist or a psychologist, that has had to undergo a bit of transformation. So for a lot of people, their first touch point with the I guess the mental health system throughout this period has been through teleconsults or has been through screen consults, which does shift dynamics quite significantly. And so from our perspective, what we think is really important is that the friends and family around them do play a really important role, because being able to articulate what you're going through, being able to articulate the emotions that you're dealing with, or the feelings that are coming up, can be really difficult if the first time you're trying to do that is over a screen with someone that you've had no connection with or no contact with prior. So being able to workshop that through with someone in a conversation is extraordinarily important. And so we urge anyone who's concerned that someone around them is struggling with their mental health or is finding these uncertain times challenging, to have that conversation and give them that space to start articulating what's going on, because it's going to make it so much easier for them when they have to do that in kind of changed circumstances at this time. And indeed, you know, we are now seeing a bit of a shift back once again to face-to-face consultations, but you know, in some places that's probably going to take a little bit of time to you know, to go back to what it once was.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the point you raised there is that it is really difficult to read some of the same signs when you are over Zoom or any other video platform. I know there was an article out recently that our team was sharing around, which was talking about Zoom fatigue, because of the whole ability, you're not keeping, you don't get to have that eyesight with each other, you know, lock each other's eyes and read the other signals, so that there is this thing you can get to the end of the day, you know, I'm absolutely exhausted because you're constantly trying to do all this stuff that you never have done before. Daniel, from your perspective, when we are, I guess, looking at a situation where we are no longer in person as much, and going on the back of what Anastasia was saying there, do you think we're at a bigger risk? I might ask you first from a point of, are we at a bigger risk of losing some of the connectivity that we have with one another? And then Anastasia, might ask you, are we at a bigger risk now of those mental health challenges rising up as well? But if I can start with you, Daniel.
Yeah, I think definitely it's a bigger risk. Look, it's interesting because a lot of organizations I worked with before the COVID problem was, they still would say they had meeting fatigue, and that meetings are bad and we need to cull meetings. And really in my work, I've found that that's a result of bad meetings, not of too many meetings. It's a result of the meetings not being effective, they're not being useful, people not feeling like they're engaged or not being heard. There's a whole bunch of complex factors. And I think the Zoom just allows that to be amplified. One of the things I often work with coaching leaders is to understand how your people are feeling. Don't just ask them in a meeting. Look at how they enter the room and look at how they exit the room. Because often people will put a bit of a mask on during a meeting and they'll, oh, I'm fine, everything's okay. And they sort of pretend, but they'll often drag themselves in a little bit. Their head will drop as they're walking into the meeting. They'll sort of pick themselves up. And as they walk out, there'll be a little tell sign there as well that something might be wrong. It's not always the case, but it's something to look for. And I think the challenge now is those times don't exist. I log on, I press Zoom, and I'm ready. And we need leaders to be more, and I think this is consistent in a pre and post-COVID world, but probably more important now than ever. We need leaders who can really dig and ask questions, build trust, and then have those deeper conversations. It's, as Anastasia was saying, it's the trust you have to have beforehand that makes this interaction either work or not work. It's not the technology. It's not the circumstance. It's the relationship trust that we've got that allows me to ask that question. And certainly if you ask someone, are you okay? And they don't trust you, their answer is not going to come from a real place. It's not their real answer. Whereas if you've got that trusted relationship, and as a leader, I work really hard with people on this, how do you build that deep sense of trust and confidence? When you've got that, this can still work. And I think this is the thing we need to help leaders focus on these times.
And Anastasia, on that note of trust there, if we kind of come back to it, do you think that is something that we are at risk of eroding a little bit with this current environment?
Definitely. And I think part of that comes down to the interactions that we're having, particularly with our colleagues. So they're certainly a lot more structured than they would have in the past. So those little moments, those what you might refer to as water cooler conversations, are less likely to occur in an environment like this where you're not face to face with your colleagues. So it's even more important that you make sure that there's time as a manager, as a leader, even as a peer, to have those kind of social touch points with your colleagues, because that's such an important part of trust building. Because I'm unlikely to feel comfortable opening up to you if all my interactions are about what project needs to be delivered when, or this is what's coming up. It's going to be very difficult for me to disclose that I'm struggling, or that there might be something that could impact my ability to deliver those particular deadlines or that work, if they're the only points of contact that we're having. And it's about thinking about creative ways to do that. It's not just doing it over Zoom. It's thinking about, the phone calls that you can make, the little touch points and check-ins that you can have if you might be more time poor. Things like sending a message, sending a note, making sure that you put time aside to recognize the pressures and stresses that people might be, facing and going under, or thinking about things that you can do to try and facilitate, well-being, so that you're fostering that culture of trust. You're fostering that culture where people feel not just supported in the workplace, but that if they do disclose that they're struggling, that that support will continue as well. So I can pull on perhaps a personal example there.
Yeah.
Are You Okay has been gifted a day of leave in recognition of, the additional work that had to be done when we shifted and adapted to these circumstances. And that's been really helpful for, for staff to understand, hey, I'm valued in this organization. This is something really important. And actually, it's really important that we take that time for ourselves as well, in these circumstances, to check in on ourselves and to spend some quality time with the people that we care about.
And that last point you were making there about ourselves, checking in with ourselves, a lot of what we're talking about here often can only be enabled by having a greater understanding of who we are. And some of the work that we've done with Katerina, who's our sort of lead neuroscientist, she did a survey. She's done a lot of work in terms of personality driven decision making and behavior. And one of the surveys she was trying to figure out about how well people understand each other, I believe it was about 79% of people were saying that they didn't know each other well enough at the moment in terms of what actually drove them. So how much do we think that people understand themselves right now? And how much do we think that people understand or know themselves well enough to be able to put themselves into other people's shoes? Like what you're talking about here, that's the key skill you have to have, particularly when it comes to empathy. So Daniel, from your perspective, do we know each other? Do we know ourselves well enough to be able to put ourselves in other people's shoes?
Yeah, look, it's a tough question because who can ever answer it, right? How well do you know yourself? I think the point though is we've got to understand how our brains actually work in this space. You build up a set of models and assumptions about the rules of the world, how the world works. You know that if you drop a ball, that it falls, right, and hits the ground, and your brain has built a model around that. And so anything that you drop should fall, and that the rules of gravity apply. Well, we do that with other things that are far more subjective. I use this example, and it's horribly stereotypical, so apologies. But if you grew up in a traditional English household and there was yelling, probably meant something bad was going down. It was something pretty heavy. If you grew up in a traditional Italian household and it was yelling, it just meant there was people talking. Like and again, a horribly stereotypical, and apologies, I mean, no offense by it, but it demonstrates that yelling doesn't mean one or the other. It's just the model we've got. And we use that constantly for all sorts of situations. So if I see someone who's sad, does that mean they're sad like I would be sad? And is my model constraining my ability to understand them, or is it helping? And I think the thing I really push on in this space is, can you be consciously curious? Can you park what you believe to be true and just sit in a beautiful space of not knowing, so that you can then openly engage with someone and find out what's going on in their world? And that state of conscious curiosity is critical to building empathy. And I think brains don't naturally do that. Brains naturally make assumptions. They naturally make assumptions because assumptions are safe and they keep you alive. So we need to, I think there's a lot of self-exploration we need, but I think we can shortcut some of that depth of exploration, which is a lifelong journey, and just say, well, am I able to get to a state where it doesn't matter what I believe, it just matters for me to be curious now, and open that up as a first port of why is someone doing what they're doing? How can I understand that? And I think that's the key first step for empathy.
And it's an interesting point there that you raise. I mean, diversity of thought, effectively, in that sense. But I know that something else that you and I have talked about outside this previously is about the role of diversity, particularly now when it comes into, well, I guess, what roles it play in challenging times. What's your view on that? Like, does it change from our normal focus at the moment in terms of diversity? Diversity was talked about a lot before. So I know I've kind of moved on a little bit from the diversity of thought to broader diversity. But do you find that it's changed a little bit from the normal focus we'd have on it to where we are now?
It's hard to say. It's sort of, I worry that it becomes a background issue, that, it's not as important now because, we've got so many other priorities. And what I'd say to that is, in any parts of business, there's tangible stuff, numbers, cash flow, all of that stuff, the FTE, headcount, all of that's really important, but it's just not everything. The other side that's really important is the intangible drivers. So our values, our relationships, our emotions, the culture, stuff that's very much more difficult to nail down and measure. And what we need to know is that we're still responsible for managing both sides, and both sides are under intense pressure right now. So if we start to take diversity out of this culture, or if we start to ignore it, start to deprioritize it, we know that people won't be getting that differentiation that they might need in the way they're looked after and supported. They won't be getting the care or motivation that really works for them. That will start to erode. And so I would say to leaders, if you're feeling like there's more pressure, then I agree there probably absolutely is. But that doesn't mean that we just default and say the numbers are all that matter. It's still incredibly important to manage both sides of the equation, and therefore, knowing how important diversity is to culture and thought and ideas and innovation. Like, tell me a business that doesn't need to be more innovative now than they did 6 months ago. Like, they absolutely do need new solutions. So getting diversity of thought is absolutely critical, and that only comes through a diverse workforce.
Anastasia, on this same topic of diversity, the reality is that no matter what culture you're from, etc., we are living in much more of an individualistic society. So when it comes back to the question that we've talked about with, asking people if they're all right. So what is our role in actually supporting those around us? Like, is it actually a moral obligation that we have, this sort of higher purpose that we have?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There's certainly a role that everyone can play in providing, I guess, being that scaffolding around someone who's going through, through a tough time or experiencing challenges associated with, this pandemic and the pressures that are coming with it. What we do know is that, there are a number of protective factors when it comes to, the most extreme end of that, suicide prevention. And so one of those protective factors is a sense of belonging and connection to others. And then the other one is, I guess, the sense that they're not a burden on others or society. So they're two things that the friends and family and colleagues surrounding someone who's going through a tough time can certainly play a role in I guess preventing as well. So when we think about that sense of connection and belonging, and this doesn't necessarily mean that just because I have people around me that I'm not going to feel disconnected. So it means what that kind of means for friends and family is that we need to make sure that we're investing that quality time in the people around us, that we're connecting with them on a meaningful level. It also means that we need to reinforce positively how important it is that that individual is to us. And when it comes to that sense of being a burden, it's really important that we consider our behaviours and actions when it comes to stigma. So stigma reduction is really important. And so if someone is going through challenges and is facing a tough time, the reason why Are You OK promotes these conversations is because when you ask that question, when you genuinely want to listen to the answer, it shows that even though you may not understand 100% what someone is going through, you have an interest in finding out and you have an interest in supporting them through that. And if they disclose to you what their struggle is and thoughts that they might be experiencing, feelings that might be coming up for them, and you respond positively, what that says to them is that just because they've disclosed and might need a bit of extra support through this, they're not a burden, and they're certainly not a burden on you or society as well. So from my personal perspective, yes, I do think we've got a moral obligation because those two protective factors really do rely on the support of friends, family, people around us.
So maybe if we can dive straight into that, because getting to more of the practical terms of how we actually spot the signs of someone who may be struggling at the moment. We've talked about a couple of things along the way, but if we really get into the practicalities of it, from your perspective, Anastasia, how do we spot those signs? What's the role of communication, social media usage, etc.? Is there anything that you could talk to us about that?
Yeah, so the kind of overarching message that we always say to people is that if you notice a change, no matter how small, trust that gut instinct. And the reason why we speak so strongly to gut instinct is because sometimes it can be one little change that you've noticed that can just get that alarm bell going in your head. Sometimes it's a confluence of factors as well. So it's really important to just think a bit more about what is normal for that particular individual, and what it is that's kind of triggered this sense that what's normal has shifted and changed. And so we do provide some guidance on things to look out for, and the kind of broad headings for that are what are they doing? So what are some of the behavioral changes that you've noticed? Perhaps they're someone super social and they've stopped, turning up to social occasions. Perhaps there's been a change in their sleep patterns and it's something that you've noticed. They're sleeping more, they're sleeping less, they're complaining about, the inability to switch off or rest. It's what they're saying. There are expressions and things that people could, start to inject into conversation. Things like "it's all too much," "I'm feeling overwhelmed," "I can't switch off." Those kinds of phrases can certainly get that alarm bell going. And then the other thing to always consider is what's going on in their life. If you know that someone has gone through a life experience or a circumstance that could add pressure or stress, maybe they've lost a loved one, maybe their job circumstances have changed, or things have happened. Maybe they've had a child for the first time. They're big shifts and changes that can put a lot of pressure and stress on us. And it's really important at those times that we're hyper vigilant and we do check in with that person and go, "Hey, I know that this has been happening for you. How are you finding everything?" So it's to trust our gut, educate ourselves on some of the things to keep an eye out for, and really, make sure that we understand what's normal for those around us, and that we are looking out for any shift in that normal.
I just maybe will break quickly to say to the audience that if you do have questions, because this is obviously something that people may not know exactly how to approach or how to spot, etc., there is the Q&A there if you would like to start using the Q&A. So just pop your questions in. It can be anonymous as well if you like to, but we'll aim to get through all of those throughout the course of this. Daniel, if I ask you from the perspective, if we shift to in the workplace, particularly if you think about leaders and even just colleagues as well, what are the sort of signs off the back of some of the stuff that Anastasia's been saying there that you would recommend people are looking for, particularly if they're trying to be more empathetic when they're actually in the workplace?
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple of things that I'd focus on. I think all of those things are absolutely spot on, and there's lots of evidence for that advice. The challenge that we have, I think, in the workplace where it becomes more significant is we can tend to get so busy and caught up in our workflow and our workload and the metrics and the project plans, and we get so fascinated with all these things that we're not even looking for those signs. And certainly remote working will create more of that problem. What we know is that your brain takes in about 11 million bits of data a second from your body, from your senses, all this stuff flows in, but your conscious brain processes just 40 of those. Now, it might be, the accuracy of that data might be double, it might be 80, but it's still a tiny fraction. And your subconscious is processing a whole lot of them. And so that gut feel that Anastasia is talking about is not, it is partly your subconscious going, hey, something's up. I don't know what's going on here, but something's not right. And you're not necessarily able to put all that together, and that's where you notice these little behaviors or these comments, or the tones changed, or the way that the angle of their eyes is telling something else. You don't necessarily think about it all, but your brain is processing it and going, something's not up. So recognizing that in the workplace, when you don't have all that interaction, you're not seeing that some of these things, that email doesn't have tone, and we know that there's all sorts of issues there. But as we try and streamline some of our work, we actually strip away some of this data that we actually use subconsciously. So I would say leaders need to, more than ever, spend more time trying to make sure that they dig into some of those questions, spend more time, if they do have any sort of trust or any sort of instinct around this, to explore further. And the other thing that is critical in this space is don't use yourself as a gauge of whether this is normal or not normal behavior. Just because you handle stress by doing X doesn't mean if someone else is doing X, then they're just handling stress the same way you're handling it. That's just a really dangerous game to play. And we see leaders all the time who bury themselves under work and have every expectation that everyone else should do exactly the same, and that they'll be fine because I feel fine. That's just a really dangerous pathway, I think, to take. So it's getting more connection, it's getting more understanding, feeding more of that subconscious processing, and that takes a lot more interaction. So I'd be saying, and we have been advising a lot of our leaders to have far more Zoom calls, far more phone calls, but make them meaningful and ask more questions, leave more silence, leave more space for people to think about what you just said, and then maybe ask the questions that they were a bit afraid to ask before. But this takes time, and that's a really powerful investment of time at this stage.
And I want to get into that notion of connection a little bit. We have had a question come through from Inika. Thank you, Inika, for your question. How do you suggest we best manage the balance of supporting staff with a personal issue, and then on the other hand, have to performance manage the person without them feeling they've been violated? So that is a really tough thing to do. If I can maybe start with you, Anastasia, if you've got any views on that, about how you would go about that.
Yeah, so something that we always encourage people to do is to take that breath before entering into the performance management exercise. So if you do know that someone, is facing personal circumstances or issues, it's really important to separate the conversation about that from the performance management environment. It should happen in a separate location. It should happen ideally before you have that kind of more structured conversation around practically how do we navigate this and ensure that we're still able to function as a business. And so that can be sometimes, if you are struggling with how to manage that balance, thinking about who else in the workforce you could call upon to reach out to that individual. Could be someone that they trust or admire. It could be someone, you know, in human resources or one of those areas that might have a little bit more experience having these conversations with that particular individual. And it could be recommending that that individual connect with a support service like the Employee Assistance Program or something like that, where they're able to disclose and kind of work through some of those issues. So really important to separate the two as much as possible and make sure that that personal conversation happens first. If you are going to have that chat, Are You OK does have resources designed specifically for managers to help them navigate those conversations and manage some of those emotional reactions that might come up as well. So if someone does start getting defensive, if someone does start, you know, reacting in a way that indicates that they're feeling anxious or under pressure, if someone does, you know, react, you know, in a kind of more visceral way with tears, etc., there's some tips and tools to kind of help you navigate those particular responses as well. And what we always recommend is that if it didn't go well, that conversation, for whatever reason, that's okay. It's really important to just think about who else you could call upon to then check in with that individual to make sure that they do feel supported, that they are able to let out what it is that they might be going through, and of course ensuring that they've got access to ongoing support if that's something that they do need.
Yeah, really good advice there. Daniel, do you have anything specific from what you've seen happen from your work within workplaces as well?
Yeah. Firstly, I just want to say thank you to Are You OK for providing those sorts of resources, and that sort of guidance is desperately needed. And a lot of people struggle. They think, oh, if the person's not feeling well, they're going through challenges, I can't have that conversation about their performance. And the way we tend to tackle this with some of our clients is to say, well, are you actually helping them in the long run by not having that conversation? Because you're probably going to do more damage than good. Yeah, you might make them feel safe, but is it their safety or is it your discomfort and your fear about it that's holding you back from the conversation? And so the underlying sort of thought process here is your job is to be the custodian of these people. You're their leader. You're responsible for their well-being in many, many ways, but not just theirs, the whole team's. So if you've got a person that's letting the team down, who's not performing, and that's putting pressure on other people, then you've got to think of the broader picture here. And we've worked through a couple of examples of this where people have been struggling, and the managers are really terrified to talk about it. But we change the conversation to be, look, if they're not performing well, then they're probably not happy in this role. They're probably not feeling their best or being their best. And that may well be contributing to other problems that they're having. So what are the ways you can support them to get to the place where they are at their best? And so, it might not be, hey, look, if you don't pull your socks up, you need to leave. It might be, look, I know that you're not feeling great about this and I see that you're struggling. What would be some things that we could do to improve the situation? Or are there other things, other jobs that you've thought about that we could help you move into, inside or outside the organisation? But taking that servant leadership role of saying, my job is to help you to be your best. And that might not be in this role. That's okay. But I want you to be at your best. And that's going to give you the best opportunity to get to that place where you will be more mentally well or more safe or whatever those different circumstances are for that person. It's ignoring the problems is a surefire way of creating more problems. And dealing with your own sort of self-comfort in having that, or the fear you might have of how this might go. This is the courageous part of leadership of knowing that it's going to be tough, but stepping into that space because it's important. I think that's a critical thing.
So staying with that in terms of what you do once you've spotted the signs and you actually want to then ask the question. It's interesting, we actually just had another question through here that relates to that what should we do when we can see that someone is not well, but they're not actually open to talking about it and they ask you not to bring it up? Anastasia, I don't know if you want to take that one, because I think it relates to how you ask, are you okay, in a sort of a safe and appropriate way, but this is a very specific one, that what if they say, no, I don't want to talk about it?
Yeah, and that's, a lot of people will probably give that response in the first instance. What we recommend doing is a bit of personal reflection if you get a response like that. So thinking about, where you sit in that person's environment. If you are someone that they may not be comfortable disclosing to, perhaps you're their manager in the first instance, is there someone else that they might trust who they could reach out to and who you could reinforce as someone that they could turn to if they do want to talk about it or are in that space where they can? That could be friends and family. It could be, someone else in the workplace, a friend of theirs, or someone that that they do turn to, or spend a bit more time with as well. So think about it in that way, but also reinforce positively the role that you want to play. If you do ever want to talk about it, I am here for you. And what can be helpful is to just mention in a nice way some of the changes that might have triggered this particular conversation or question from you. So it's just that I've noticed, you seem a bit more tired than usual, or I've noticed, something's just off here. I'm always happy to talk to you about this. Completely understand if nothing's going on. Completely understand if you're not comfortable coming to me. But just know that I'm always here, happy to grab a coffee if you want to. That's a positive way to reinforce the role that you want to play, and also to ensure that that person isn't receiving negative messages about conversation or feeling like, they're forced into a conversation that they're not comfortable with. And it does come back to those points that Daniel was raising earlier as well, in which he talked about the importance of trust. And it's also the importance of the broader culture that exists in your organization. So if your organization perhaps isn't at a point where you could honestly say all our employees feel supported and all our employees feel that if they did disclose that they would be supported through those challenges, then it's probably unlikely that that individual is going to open up in the workplace to either a manager or a peer. In that case, emphasize support outside of work, because that individual may make the decision to disclose to someone as a result of that as well. And also keep an eye on them. If you see things escalating, try again to have that conversation in a reasonable period afterwards. And a reasonable period can look like many things, but as a kind of yardstick, we would recommend about a week or two. Check back in with them and say, hey, just wanted to see how you're going. And the other thing you can do, invest a bit more time. If you feel like that trust isn't there yet, focus on building it. Make a bit more of an effort to, to try and connect with that colleague, so that as they're going through this, they might be more likely to answer actually when you ask that question the second time as well.
And it's interesting as you were talking about it there, and you then referenced the trust part again that we talked about. I think that particularly when it comes to the workplace. So if you look at the fact that, much more often people can be very, very different people when they come to the workplace. They're guarded. They put on this different personality. And we've got a podcast coming up with someone in the US called Hans Hickler, who talks about having the blinkers on, and we try to put walls up and not be the sort of the same people we are. So if we come back to where all of this actually starts, like how do we actually make asking, are you okay, a far more natural response? I suppose a lot of this would come back to the power of connection. And I think this was something that was talked about a little bit at the start of the conversation as well, where how do we increase the connection, the deep levels of connection that we have with people, so that we're asking more personal questions anyway, therefore the trust is built, and therefore it should be easier to have that are you okay conversation in the first place. And so Daniel, I don't know if for you, is that where it starts in the workplace? Is it around that connection piece?
Yeah, it is. And a lot of it is to do with this idea of trust, and how do you build trust, and what does it look like, and culture. And I see lots of people who get the title of head of culture, and I really feel for them, because it's an incredibly tough job to try and manage this intangible, constantly moving, rapidly changing, dynamic thing. But the simple way to think about culture is it's sort of the average of the next million little interactions that happen in your workplace. And everything counts. Every tiny little thing is a signal, consciously or subconsciously, that this is how we do things around here. And, I've worked in businesses where the CEO gets in the lift and they start a conversation and they know your name and they get to know everyone. But every other time when they get in the lift and there's a senior leader in there, they look at their phones, they don't say anything. And so the culture is actually not what the CEO is doing, it's what everyone's doing. And so part of, how do you have these conversations? How do you build an environment where you have higher trust? Well, you've got to do that through asking more questions. asking, are you okay? But really meaning it. I see a lot of people tongue in cheek, oh, it's, are you okay? We need to get past this superficial thing of, I did the task, and it's actually, why did I do it? What are my principles? What do I believe in? What do I care about? These are the foundations that humans really form culture of. And so if you're, one of the things I love that Anastasia was talking about is when you're having feedback conversations, talk about the behavior. You're not talking about a person. You're talking about what they did, not who they are, in terms of judging them. And, that's a big part of building trust, that we can all comfortably talk about the things that we're doing, our behaviors, without feeling like that they're judging me as a human being. My report wasn't good doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It just means the report wasn't good. And so starting to build a culture where we foster this, we support each other, and there's genuine care for each other in terms of individual people, even though we can have challenging conversations about the work that we do. So starting to separate some of these tangible and intangible pieces and really being able to manage that well is critical. I see most people, when you talk about building those walls, it's because they want to leave themselves outside. They want to leave their identity outside, their personality, who they are. They want to defend all of that. They don't want that to be at risk of being criticized. But in doing that, all of that amazing magic that gets formed in all of that space also stays outside. And what walks in is a shell, a robot, a data entry, the bare minimum of what I bring. And so, if your biggest asset, your biggest resource, the biggest cost in your business is people, and they're leaving half of themselves outside, it doesn't make any sense. Imagine if you hired, you bought all these computers and only half of them worked. You'd be devastated. Well, let's make sure we're not doing that with our people. I think this is what leaders really need to focus on in culture. It's what we do and how we do what we do.
And culture is inevitably put under pressure, particularly at times right now. Like people are facing pressures from all sorts. The people that have lost their jobs, people that are struggling with juggling the full-time family now being at home, people that are juggling trying to stay focused, people are feeling pressure from trying to perform more and more, even down to the levels of pressure, which I don't know if you've seen, but it's almost like everyone feels like they have to take up some new hobby or learn a language or something. Everyone's putting pressure on themselves as well to try and get through this. When we think about, well, if we're under pressure to survive, thrive, and everything in between, how do you think we balance that? And Anastasia, I'd be really curious on your thoughts about how you think we balance particularly this notion of the pressure on ourselves with actually looking outwards and opening ourselves up to other people to understand what's going on and how we can actually help them rather than just pressuring ourselves.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So I think something that I would love to bring up here is actually something that Tim and I were talking about prior to today's webinar. And it was this idea of the time famine that many of us face. So there's a lot of pressure that we put on ourselves when we try to fill absolutely every single hour of the day with structured activities. And by doing that, what we're actually doing is that we're shutting ourselves off to those more natural moments and those less structured moments of connection with other people around us, our family, the people that we live with, our friends, etc. And there's actually research that shows that when we are in that time famine, when there's that time pressure applied, we're less likely to see those signs of distress around us, notice that someone does need it. We're actually less likely to be compassionate towards others. And that's not because of a change in intention. It's purely because our brain is focused so much on these activities that we're unable to notice what's happening around us and to clock that actually I need to check in with that person. I need to be there for them and I need to spend that time. So something that I think we can all do is to perhaps reassess what we're loading our days up with and try and have a bit more idle time and less structured time in that, which we can allocate to those particular activities. And then the other thing that we would always recommend is to really do that analysis on yourself, and on those around you when you are well, on the things that do keep you in that place. So when we're going through a struggle, we may not be able to articulate or envision what keeps us level and what keeps us grounded, because we're so focused on the circumstances that we're in. So it's really important that when we are well, when we are level and grounded, we do that personal reflection on what's keeping us there, and that we share it with the people around us, because we normalize those conversations about what brings us joy, what keeps us in this space. And it means that when that starts to change, people around us are attuned to what it is that could help, and can help to facilitate that, either through the conversations that we're having or through the suggestions that we're giving and the activities that we're facilitating for the people around us as well.
And Dan, if I can ask you specifically around the balance between the focus on performance, empathy, and understanding, what's your take on that? How we actually achieve a balance there?
Look, it's funny because there's such a scourge of busy, right, which I think plays into this time problem. And what we don't often take accountability for is that we create the busyness. We all get the same number of minutes each day. No one has more or less. You get to do it with them what you will. And we've built this ladder at Empathic Consulting, saying most people want to be a strategic leader, but we're actually stuck down here being busy leaders. And the first thing we need to do is really understand what's important versus what's urgent. What are we spending our time on? Do we need to do this now? How do we prioritize that? And a lot of the challenge for leaders is they got to where they got to by working really hard and doing lots of stuff. My view is that the key to being a strategic leader is knowing what stuff you need to now focus on, and it's going to be different. So they sort of step through from being a busy leader to being a bossy leader, where we can't delegate well and hassle all our staff, and then we learn to empower people and become a board leader. We have too much time in our hands now. Well, what do I do with this free space? And a lot of people get nervous at that stage and migrate back down and just take up new tasks. But at that stage, and this fits exactly in what Anastasia was speaking about, we move up to being a mindful leader. We move up to actually understanding how we do what we do, why we do what we do. Why do we believe what we believe? Is it right? Is it wrong? What if it wasn't? We start to ask questions of ourselves. We move into the curious leadership stage, where we start to ask questions of others and explore. And it's at that stage that leaders start to find these opportunities and ideas. They start to find new things that they hadn't seen before, innovations and opportunities that were lost in all of the busyness. And being a strategic leader, in my view, is being able to join those dots. It's putting those diverse things together, being able to orchestrate all of these amazing things. And you can't do it if you're stuck down in the weeds. You can't do it if you're too busy. So I'd almost... we do this a lot. We compel our leaders to, it's not about you wasting time or trying to get better balance or trying to make sure you do more things. I don't believe in those people who work 20-hour days and never sleep and all that sort of stuff. I just don't think it works for most people. For most people, the real question I would ask is, what's your superpower? Where are you at your best? What do you love to do? And then how do we get other people to support you? Build a team around you, engage them, keep them feeling wonderful, and then focus on the things that you're really good at. So the pressure that we're feeling is often, the expectations we put ourselves under, and we want to try and do it all. And the reality is most people fail because they try and do things that they're not good at. They have no place being, and they don't get support from people who know how to help them. And so getting people who can support you and help you through, whether that be with your mental health, whether that be your physical health, whether that be with your strategic thinking, no matter which area of your sort of journey it is, get the help so you can do those things well. And I think that's the key to balance, is doing the things that we're good at.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We had another comment come through that was just sort of saying that, colleagues, we definitely feel like we're putting more pressure on ourselves to ensure that we're productive, if not more productive, while working remotely as well. That sort of inherent pressure that comes along along with it when you don't have that visibility. I did want to get to this question because it's a really important one before we do finish. But in the context of everything happening at the moment, there is the challenge. I think we've touched on a little bit, but I wanted to make sure it's sort of crystal clear about what people do right now. If you ask the question of, are you okay? And someone actually says, no, I'm not. Because this is much more likely to occur now than it was before. Anastasia, if you have practical steps that you could suggest about what someone actually does, if they ask the question, then someone says, no, I'm not, no, what do I do now?
Yeah, so Are You Okay has 4 conversation steps. And so, in this particular scenario, you've already done step number 1, which is ask, are you okay? So ask them how they're going, and create that space so that they can open up. The next thing that's really important is to listen. And this is to listen with an open mind. And so what we recommend doing at this point is to ask open questions so that you give that person that space to share their story. Reflect back some of what you've heard so that they know that you are paying attention in this conversation. But it can also help to clarify and make sure that you've understood what's going on for them so that you are able to provide appropriate support to them. Because the next step after you've listened and you've given them that space to really open up and share what's going on for them is encourage action. And that doesn't mean immediately jumping to professional support and saying call a psychologist. It is asking those questions that we've just gone through here. What's bringing you joy at the moment? What keeps you level? What have you done in previous times where this has come up for you that's really helped? And how can we make sure that you're able to do that through these circumstances? And it can also help after you've kind of teased out that what works for them to ask a bit more directly, what can I do to support you? I really want to be there with you on this journey. What can I do as well? And then the next step that we think is really important is after this conversation to not just leave it at that conversation, to check back in with them a couple of days later or possibly a week later to see how they're going and to also talk through some of the things that you talked about. You mentioned that this brought you joy. Is that something that you've started doing again? Did you take that step that we talked about? Did you access that support that's available? How are you feeling right now? How's the barometer going? Because that genuine care and support can make a real difference when someone's going through this. Now, sometimes when someone says no, it can mean that they're at a bit more of a pointy end. So they might be experiencing really tough emotions and need some immediate support. And what we always recommend in a situation like that is to keep that conversation going and speak openly with that person. If you are concerned about their immediate safety, to contact an appropriate support service like Lifeline, who can talk you through that conversation while you're having it. And you can do that really openly with that person. Seek their permission first. I think it's really important that we do talk to a support service like Lifeline to make sure that you feel safe in this moment. And that's something that I do. I work in this space, and as working in the content side, I'm talking to people in crisis on a fairly regular basis, and I still call up Lifeline sometimes to just road test that conversation to make sure that I am approaching it in the best way possible. And that's something that a lot of people don't know, is that these support services that are out there, Beyond Blue, Lifeline, Suicide Callback Service, they actually exist not just for the person in crisis, but for the people around them who might need to just road test, what can I do? How do I talk to this person? What support can I provide through this? And they're a really good source prior to the conversation, during the conversation, and afterwards if you need to debrief that experience and kind of talk through, what that brought up for you as well, which is also really important. So I might add a 5th step in there, which is self-care. Check in with yourself after a conversation and make sure that you've, that you've got support around you too, because it can be tough to hear some things when someone's sharing the circumstances that are making them feel less level and bringing up those tough emotions as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Such good advice for people to take away. And staying on this topic of what happens next, Daniel, from your perspective, what are practical steps that we can take, particularly leaders probably can take, but also colleagues? I think it's so important. It shouldn't just be a thing that leaders do. What steps can we take to build this greater sense of empathy, particularly at work, so that we're better equipped to not only form the relationships and connections, but to deal with crises and how people go through some of these challenging times?
Yeah, I think, look, there's one part of this that I'm really passionate about. I actually wrote a kid's book about this idea of resilience because I saw it being done a certain way that I really didn't connect with. And the whole idea is that we sometimes default back to giving advice really quickly. You know, what you should do is, or what we need to do is, or you know, as an organisation, maybe we need to completely overhaul all of our policies, all of our systems and processes. We try and sort of do things quickly that are going to change the world. And what it doesn't do is really get to the heart of what's going on and the complex environment that our people are going through. And actually what a lot of people need is just to have those questions asked, to actually live in an environment where there's psychological safety, where there's it's okay to say I'm not going so good. It's okay to open up to someone. You know, a lot of people I work with, they feel like there's this pressure that if I say that something's not right, if I say something's wrong, everything's going to fall apart and I'm going to be persecuted. And, you know, I've got to have this steely awe of perfection about everything that I do. And there's a lack of authenticity in some of our business cultures that we need to address. And so I would say as a leader, how do you role model that? How do you open up the vulnerability, but give it as a sign of hope that, look, I'm really struggling with this. You know, it's really tough trying to balance. You know, for us, it's tough trying to balance. There's no more conferences. We're having to do everything online. You know, we've got a 2-year-old at home, and all of these things are a lot of pressure. But I know that if we work together through this, we're going to be in a better place than if we try and do it alone. I know that if we stick to our values and we hold firm on building better relationships, we're going to be better than if we try and break this all apart and you know, find a brand new way. We don't want to rely on sort of throwing everything up in the air and hoping it falls well. So I think it's a good time for leaders to sort of take that time and patience to use this space to reflect and ask questions, build relationships, and start to form a culture that's about understanding and vulnerability, and not one that's about systems, processes, and policies.
Totally. Couldn't agree more. And Anastasia, any final comments from you about, particularly from an Are You OK perspective, on things that people should be doing and where they can come to?
Yeah, I'm just going to quickly point to the elements of a culture that we think are really important because it ties in so nicely to what Daniel's just said. So the first thing is to make sure that there's help resources available for people in your workplace. Now, your organisation might have an employee assistance program, but if not, make sure that information about what external support is available is made is promoted quite publicly in the workplace as well. And you can find lots of those supports on the Are You OK website on the Find Help page. To think about how you're managing circumstances that can bring stress to team members. So that's things like workload. It's things like, you know, the type of deadlines that you're setting in the workplace. You know, the kinds of experiences that people might have on that day-to-day basis. The third one is how senior leaders are role modeling positive behaviour in the workplace, because that buy-in from the top is so important for that culture, you know, from the bottom right through to the top as well. And to do those engagement surveys and monitor your progress as well. It's okay if you're not perfect from day one, but just make sure that you're checking in on that team culture and getting that feedback so that you can continue to grow and I guess create that you know, that space where people do feel supported, and to of course reward those you know, those positive behaviors in the workplace as well. To promote peer support and to share stories that actually demonstrate, you know, what a positive culture is as well, because those kinds of 7 elements, you can learn more about them on the Are You OK website, really do help create that environment where everyone feels supported, everyone feels that they can share what's going on, and that if they are going through a tough time, that, you know, the organisation and their peers will have their back as much as possible. So strongly encourage heading to the Are You OK website. And of course, if today has brought up tough emotions for you, please do seek support either from a friend, a family member, someone you trust, or by reaching out to a support service like Lifeline, which is available 24/7 on 131114. And you can find other services and tools at areyouok.org.au.
Perfect. And I think on that note, I would just I'm just putting up on the screen here that they're the links to both our experts who came on today. So yeah, I couldn't agree more and encourage more people to follow Anastasia and Daniel's advice, and you can check out their work there at those different websites. And also from a from an engagement perspective, yes, this is something that, that we can help with as well. Like if you're looking at just how you can get more real-time feedback on how people are feeling, we won't claim to obviously have the mental health angle. I think that's where people like Are You OK? Are doing such a fantastic job and should be so commended for all the work that they do. But if you're trying to get more of that understanding on how your people are feeling in real time, it's something that you can have a look at as well. But for now, I know we're right on time. Thank you so much. It is such an important topic. I'm really appreciative that you took the time out to have a chat with me, and hopefully this is something that people can really take away and start to practice so much more in what they do, because we need to be asking these questions. We need to be creating these connections. We need to be fostering this trust. So Daniel, Anastasia, thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.